Lauren was standing in the middle of a pawn shop in downtown Chicago when she screamed. The velvet case slipped from her hands. Metal screws scattered across the tile floor. And the clerk slowly read the note out loud. "I'm watching you, Lauren." At that exact moment, my phone vibrated. The hidden camera in my bedroom had just captured her opening my safe. I looked at the screen. I froze. And instead of calling my son, I did something else. Because one question kept pounding in my head. How much more was she planning to take if I hadn't stopped her? "I'm glad you're here. Tell me what city you're watching from. I really do read every comment. And if stories about family, betrayal, and second chances mean something to you, stay with me. Because what happened next nearly destroyed my son." Earlier that afternoon, everything felt perfectly normal. I remember that detail clearly, because normal is the most dangerous disguise betrayal can wear. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee. The ceramic mug was warm in my palms, the faint smell of hazelnut creamer rising with the steam. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen blinds in long, golden stripes, stretching across the hardwood floor like nothing in the world could possibly go wrong inside those walls. Daniel had called around noon. "Mom, I'll be late at the cafe," he said. I could hear the clatter of dishes behind him, the espresso machine hissing. "But I'll stop by tonight. I want to talk to you about something." His voice sounded tired, but steady. Normal. "Of course," I told him. "Drive safe." Nothing in his tone warned me. Nothing suggested the storm already forming just beneath the surface of our lives. Lauren had texted me that morning. "How are you feeling today? I might drop off some fresh pie." Sweet. Thoughtful. Attentive. That was her specialty. I even smiled when I read it. The house was quiet in that comfortable way homes become after years of memories. The refrigerator hummed. A clock ticked in the hallway. The painting above my bedroom closet hung perfectly straight, a small landscape Daniel had bought me years ago, insisting it reminded him of our old family vacations. Behind that painting was the safe. Locked. Silent. Heavy. Inside it, wrapped carefully in soft cloth, rested my late husband's silver pocket watch. It had stopped at 8:17 p.m. The exact moment his heart did. I never repaired it. I never wound it again. Some things are not meant to move forward. Years later, Daniel tracked it down at an estate auction in Boston after it had been mistakenly sold during the chaos of settling debts. He paid more than he could afford to bring it home. "Mom," he'd said when he handed it to me, eyes shining with quiet pride, "this belongs with you." And it did. Not because of the money. Because of the memory. Earlier that afternoon, I walked into my bedroom to put away laundry. I remember glancing at the painting. Still straight. Still covering the small steel door embedded into the wall behind it. The safe was locked. I checked it out of habit. Twisted the dial. Listened for the solid click. Secure. I had no idea she already knew the combination. I had no idea that trust, offered so casually between husband and wife, had quietly become access. When Daniel married Lauren, I told myself I would not be the suspicious mother-in-law. I would not search for flaws. I would not compete. I would not interfere. So when she offered to help organize paperwork a few months back, I let her sit at this very kitchen table with my folders spread neatly in front of her. Insurance policies. Property documents. Old tax returns. She was so efficient. So careful. So interested. At the time, I thought she was trying to help us all feel secure. Now I understand she was studying the map. That afternoon, though, I still believed we were safe. I rinsed my coffee mug. Water ran clear down the drain. Outside, a delivery truck passed. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. Everything looked ordinary. Lauren even stopped by briefly around 3, carrying a pie box tied with twine. She kissed my cheek. Asked about my arthritis. Complimented the curtains. Her smile never wavered. If she felt guilt, she hid it flawlessly. When she left, I remember thinking how lucky Daniel was. How relieved I felt that he wasn't alone in the world anymore. I had already buried one love in this lifetime. I didn't want my son to ever feel that kind of emptiness. So I ignored the faint unease that flickered through me when her eyes drifted toward the hallway. Toward my bedroom. Toward the closet. It was subtle. Barely noticeable. But it was there. And I dismissed it. Because believing the best in someone is easier than preparing for the worst. By 5 o'clock, the light outside had softened. The house carried that late afternoon stillness, the kind that feels suspended between peace and something unnamed. If someone had told me that within hours I would be watching my daughter-in-law open my safe on a hidden camera feed, I would have laughed. If someone had told me that by nightfall my son's marriage would be cracking beneath the weight of secrets, I would have called them dramatic. But betrayal rarely announces itself with thunder. It begins quietly. In polite texts. In shared codes. In trust given without conditions. That afternoon, I still believed in the illusion of our family. I believed love was solid. I believed loyalty was mutual. I believed the safe behind my painting protected what mattered most. I was wrong. And by the time I understood how wrong I was, the illusion had already begun to crumble. The first real warning sign appeared a week earlier. Not in a dramatic argument. Not in raised voices. But in silence. We were sitting at my dining room table. Daniel had brought the watch out after dinner because he'd finally had it appraised. I remember the way he handled it, carefully, reverently, like he was holding something living. They said it could be worth close to $500,000 now, he said, almost apologetically. Collectors are crazy about pieces like this. $500,000. The number settled into the room like smoke. I didn't care about the valuation. To me, it was still frozen at 8:17 p.m. It was still the weight of my husband's hand in mine. But I glanced at Lauren anyway. Daniel was smiling at me. Lauren was not looking at me. She was staring at the watch. Not at the engraving. Not at the history. Not at the story Daniel had just retold about chasing it down at an estate auction in Boston. She stared at the case. At the metal. At the number. I saw it then, a flicker. Quick. Controlled. But unmistakable. Calculation. She asked practical questions. Is it insured? Where do you keep something like that? Do you ever think about selling it and investing the money? Daniel laughed. Mom would never sell it. She smiled politely. But it didn't reach her eyes. That was the moment something inside me shifted. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. The kind that tightens your chest before your mind catches up. I changed the subject that night. Served dessert. Cleared plates. Pretended not to notice the way her gaze kept drifting back toward the velvet case resting beside Daniel's elbow. Later, after they left, I stood alone in my bedroom. The house felt different. Quieter. I pulled the painting aside and opened the safe. The dial turned with a heavy, familiar click. I held the watch in my palm, feeling its cold surface warm slowly against my skin. $500,000. That number meant nothing to me. But it might mean everything to someone drowning. And I was beginning to suspect Lauren was drowning. 3 days later, I overheard something I was never meant to hear. Daniel had stepped onto the back porch to take a call. The kitchen window was slightly open. I wasn't eavesdropping, not intentionally. But when your son's voice carries tension you've never heard before, you don't ignore it. What do you mean it's gone? He said. Silence. Then, Lauren, how could you not tell me? His tone wasn't angry. It was wounded. I stayed perfectly still by the sink. Cryptocurrency. That was the word that drifted in pieces through the window. Investments. Short-term returns. A platform that vanished overnight. $150,000. Gone. My stomach dropped. He kept his voice low, controlled, trying to understand. Trying to fix. Trying to protect her from consequences she had created. When he came back inside, he looked exhausted. He saw me watching him and forced a smile. Everything okay? I asked gently. Yeah, he said too quickly. Just business stuff. Business stuff. That night I lay awake long after midnight. $500,000. 150,000 lost. Questions about insurance. Questions about storage. Questions about selling. The pieces were beginning to align, and I didn't like the picture they formed. Because if I was right, this wouldn't just be about money. It would destroy my son. And Daniel had already lost his father. He didn't deserve to lose his marriage to deception too. I didn't sleep much that week. I watched. I listened. Lauren became slightly different once I knew what to look for. More attentive. More eager to visit. More curious about details that had never interested her before. Are you sure the safe is secure? She asked casually one afternoon. It's old, I replied. But reliable. She nodded slowly. Reliable. So was trust. Until it isn't. By the end of that week, the unease inside me had hardened into something sharper. Resolve. If she was desperate, desperation would push her. And if she crossed that line, if she reached for something that did not belong to her, I needed to know before Daniel paid the price. I wasn't going to accuse her. I wasn't going to warn her. But I was no longer going to stand blindly in the dark. Because I had already buried one man I loved. I would not watch my son be emotionally buried by betrayal. Not without seeing it coming first. That evening, Daniel sat in my living room with his coffee balanced on his knee, laughing at something on his phone as if the world had never heard him. The lamplight softened his face, and for a moment he looked younger, like the boy who used to race his toy cars along this same carpet, making engine noises with his mouth. I smiled back, but my chest tightened anyway. I knew that feeling. The same tightness. The same cold rush that starts at the base of your throat and spreads through your ribs like ice water. It was the exact sensation I felt years ago. The night my husband died. I can still see the kitchen clock from that night. I can still hear the weather report droning on the TV, promising clear skies while my hands shook too badly to change the channel. I remember the metallic taste of panic, the way the room narrowed into a tunnel when the phone rang. He'd been driving home from work. A routine route. An ordinary Tuesday. Then a sudden, stupid collision at an intersection and the word instant said by a stranger who sounded far too calm. When I arrived at the hospital, someone guided me into a small room with beige walls and a box of tissues that looked untouched. A doctor spoke, but I only caught fragments, couldn't revive, I'm sorry, no pain. In my purse, his silver pocket watch sat heavy as a stone. He'd carried it every day. Wound it every morning. Told me it kept him honest about time, that it reminded him not to waste it. That night, it stopped at 8:17 p.m., the exact moment his heart did. I never repaired it. I never wound it again. I didn't want time to move on without him. For years it stayed hidden, wrapped in cloth, because touching it felt like touching the edge of a wound that never fully sealed. Then life did what life always does. It demanded groceries, bills, school forms, birthdays. It forced me to stand up even when I wanted to stay folded in half. Daniel grew into a man while I pretended I was fine. He learned my silences the way other kids learn lullabies. And then, years later, when he was older and working too many hours and saving too little money, he called me with a strange excitement in his voice. "Mom," he said, "I found Dad's watch." I didn't believe him at first. I couldn't. The watch had disappeared after my husband's death during a rushed estate cleanout, a mistake that haunted me. But Daniel had tracked it down through auction records and collectors and sheer stubborn love. He bought it back at an estate auction in Boston. I still remember the day he placed it in my hands. He didn't make a speech. He didn't ask for praise. He just said, quietly, "This belongs with you." In moments like this, memories don't ask permission. They return with weight. So as Daniel laughed in my living room, unaware of the debt, the questions, the hunger in Lauren's eyes, I felt that old fear rise again, not of death, but of loss. Because there are losses that don't involve funerals. There are losses that happen while the person you love is still breathing. And I had already survived one devastating ending. I was not going to stand by and watch my son walk blindly into another. I studied him when he wasn't looking, the faint crease between his brows, the way he rubbed his thumb along the rim of his mug. He was tired in the way only good people get tired, from carrying more than they admit, from trying to be steady for someone else. Lauren had that effect on him lately. He called it stress at work, but I'd begun to notice how often he checked his bank app, how quickly he changed subjects when money came up, how he apologized for things that weren't his fault. I wanted to reach across the room and tell him everything. To say, "She asked about selling it. I heard you on the porch." But I didn't. Because the truth, once spoken, can't be taken back. It changes the shape of a marriage. It changes the way a son looks at his wife, and the way a mother is remembered. That's what grief teaches you. Disaster doesn't arrive with a siren. It arrives quietly, disguised as normal. I had spent years promising myself I would never be blindsided again. If danger came near my family, I would see it first. I would stop it. That night, after Daniel left, I held the pocket watch again. Cold silver. Smooth lid. The stopped hands. 8:17. I pressed it to my palm and whispered a promise I didn't know I was making until I heard it out loud. I won't lose him too. Then I placed it back in the safe, slid the painting into place, and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark. My fear wasn't loud. It was patient. And it was telling me that whatever Lauren was planning, it had already started. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. I wanted proof before I broke my son's heart with suspicion alone. So I made a choice I never imagined making as a mother. I would set a trap, and I would let her step into it. For Daniel, I had to. No more. When Daniel first introduced Lauren, she was charming. Perfect smile. Thoughtful gifts. Flawless manners. She brought lemon bars the first time she came over, and she laughed at my stories like she genuinely wanted to hear them. She called me Mrs. Hale at first, then Mom with a sweetness that felt almost practiced. Daniel watched her like he'd won something, like he'd won a bet no one else knew he was making. I wanted to like her. God, I tried. After my husband died, I'd carried Daniel through grief like you carry a sleeping child, careful not to jostle him awake. When he met Lauren, I told myself this was his reward. Someone soft. Someone steady. Someone who would keep him from feeling that hollow loneliness I knew too well. And for a while, she played the part perfectly. But small things bothered me. It started with jokes. Little comments tossed out with a grin, easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. Old-fashioned finances, she teased once when I mentioned balancing a checkbook. You're adorable. Adorable. Like I was a museum exhibit. Then came the questions, always wrapped in concern. Do you have everything set up, like beneficiaries and stuff? She asked one afternoon while helping me put away groceries. Her tone was light, but her eyes stayed on me too long. Another time, she offered to help organize my documents. Just to make things easier for Daniel, she said. In case anything ever happens. She said it like love. It sounded like responsibility. But it landed in my stomach like a stone. I noticed how quickly she learned the layout of my house. Not just where the extra mugs were, but which floorboard near the hallway creaked, which window stuck, which key fit which lock. She remembered details Daniel didn't. She watched. Once, I found her in my bedroom doorway, smiling as if she'd simply gotten turned around. "Oh. Sorry," she chirped. I was looking for the bathroom. The bathroom was in the opposite direction. I let it go. I didn't want to be the suspicious mother-in-law. I didn't want to poison my son's happiness with my own fear. Then my neighbor, Mrs. Rios, mentioned something that should have snapped me awake. "I saw your son's wife earlier," she said, watering her roses. "She was across the street, just staring at your place." I laughed, automatically. Maybe she was waiting for Daniel. Mrs. Rios didn't laugh back. No. She looked like she was evaluating it. Like a realtor. That night, I told myself it was nothing. That people misread things. That I was tired. That grief makes you suspicious. But the red flags kept piling up, small enough to ignore one by one, heavy enough to crush you all at once. Lauren asked about the value of the house. About property taxes. About whether my husband had left anything special behind. She complimented my jewelry more than once, fingers hovering near my wrist as if she wanted to feel the weight. And every time, Daniel defended her without being asked. "She's just curious, Mom," he'd say, smiling. "She wants to be close to you." I nodded. I smiled. I swallowed my doubts. Because wanting to believe is a kind of hunger, too. And I was hungry for my son to be safe. So I kept my instincts tucked away, hidden like the watch itself. I told myself I was imagining patterns. I told myself Lauren was simply enthusiastic. But deep down, I knew. Charm can be a mask. And Lauren wore hers like she'd practiced in front of a mirror. The clearest moment came at a family dinner when Daniel stepped outside to take a call. The room went quiet behind him, and Lauren's shoulders relaxed in a way I'd never seen. She glanced at his phone left on the table, then at me, as if checking whether I was watching. I was. She reached for it anyway, quick, casual, like she was just moving it out of the way. But her thumb swiped once, twice. Her smile stayed in place while her eyes scanned the screen. When she noticed me staring, she didn't flinch. She only tilted her head and said, "He forgets things. I just like to keep us organized." Us. Not him. Not their marriage. Us, as if my son were an asset to manage. Later, I caught her going through the drawer where I kept spare keys and old envelopes. She froze mid-motion, then laughed too loudly. "I'm looking for stamps," she said. There were no stamps in that drawer. She'd asked me for stamps the week before, and I'd shown her exactly where they were. I started to feel like my home had invisible tripwires. Like every room held something she might want, something she might measure. And still, every time Daniel wrapped his arm around her shoulders, she softened instantly, eyes bright, voice gentle, the picture of devotion. He saw that version of her and nothing else. I told myself that I was overreacting. But trust is not blind. Trust is built on what you do when no one is looking. And when Lauren thought no one was looking, she searched. Then I overheard Daniel on the phone. It happened on a Tuesday evening, the kind where the sky turns bruised purple over Chicago and the streetlights flicker on like reluctant witnesses. Daniel had stepped onto my back porch to get better signal, and I was inside rinsing plates, letting the warm water run longer than it needed to. I wasn't trying to listen. I swear I wasn't. But his voice cracked on one word, and a mother's body reacts before her mind can pretend it didn't hear. Lauren, what do you mean it's gone? Silence. Then a low, frantic reply I couldn't make out. Daniel swallowed hard. 150,000? That's our money. That's my savings. The number punched the air out of me. Crypto. Schemes. A guaranteed return. A platform that vanished overnight. She'd hidden it from him, from everyone, until the lie became too heavy to carry alone, and then she dropped it in his lap like a live grenade. When he came back in, he looked hollowed out. He kissed my cheek, forced a smile, and asked if I wanted dessert. I watched his hands tremble as he opened the fridge. Suddenly, Lauren's interest in the watch made sense. I didn't confront her. I didn't tell Daniel I'd heard. I only nodded, played normal, and let my fear turn into something sharper, planning. The next morning I drove to a little electronics shop on Halsted and bought a hidden camera small enough to fit behind a stack of shoeboxes. I told myself it was temporary. Just until my nerves calmed down. I installed it in my bedroom facing the closet, angled so it could see the painting swing aside and the safe door beneath. My hands shook the whole time. Not from guilt, from the sick realization that I was preparing for a crime inside my own home. Then I changed the safe code. Not because I wanted to punish my son. Because I wanted to protect him. But I did something else too, something that made my stomach twist. I let Daniel believe the code stayed the same. He'd always known the old combination, the one I'd set years ago when grief still made me lock everything away. I never thought he'd give it to anyone. He was my son. He was loyalty in human form. 3 days later, while we stood in the kitchen, he mentioned, casually, like it was nothing, Lauren's helping me get our finances straight. She's stressed, Mom. I'm trying to support her. Support her. I heard the unspoken part, don't judge her. Don't make this harder. I put my hand over his for a second. Of course, I said. You're a good man. And then I waited. Because once a person learns the location of a treasure, they don't forget. They circle back. They measure risks. They look for the moment the house goes quiet. I knew she would come. Not because I wanted to think the worst of her, because desperation has patterns. Debts have gravity. And that kind of missing money pulls people toward the nearest thing that can fill the hole. So I made the house look unchanged. I straightened the painting. I dusted the shelf beside it. I left life exactly as it had always been. And every night, before bed, I checked the camera feed on my phone. I watched my own hallway like it belonged to someone else. I hated what I was becoming. But love will turn you into a guard dog if it has to. By the end of the week, my nerves were stretched so thin that every creak sounded like a confession. Then Lauren texted again, sweet as sugar. How are you feeling today? I might drop off some fresh pie. This time, I didn't smile. I charged my phone. I made sure the camera was recording. And I waited for the first real strike. 2 nights later, I heard them in my hallway while I folded towels upstairs. I just don't want Mom worrying, Daniel said. I won't touch anything, Lauren replied, soft and steady. I only need options. If there's an emergency, if you can't reach her, you know how stubborn she is. A pause, then his sigh. Fine. The code is still the old one. And he spoke the numbers like they meant nothing. My mouth went dry. Thank you, she breathed. You're doing the right thing. I sat down hard on the bed, staring at the closet as if it could stare back. That was it. Not a theory anymore. She had the motive, and now she had the key. So I made the house look unchanged. I smiled. I played trusting. And I started building her opportunity. I told Daniel I might visit my sister for a couple days. He sent a heart emoji. Lauren answered first, that sounds wonderful. You deserve a little trip. Wonderful, I thought, slipping my phone into my pocket. Yes. For her. And as I packed an overnight bag I didn't intend to take anywhere, I felt the last of my doubt burn away. Now all she had to do was come. I charged my phone, tested the live feed, and set the volume high enough to wake me from sleep. Waiting felt like holding my breath underwater. But love, I reminded myself, sometimes means watching. Alone. Okay, when I pretended to visit my sister in Denver, Lauren used the spare key. I didn't even make it to the highway. I drove 2 blocks, turned into a grocery store parking lot, and waited with my phone in my hand like it was a detonator. The camera feed stayed still for almost an hour. Just my empty hallway. My closed bedroom door. Ordinary quiet. Then, at 2:14 p.m., the front door opened. Lauren stepped inside with a tote bag and a confidence that made my stomach lurch. She didn't call out. Didn't hesitate. She kicked off her shoes like she lived there, walked straight down the hall, and went into my bedroom. No wandering. No searching. Purpose. She swung the painting aside. The safe stared back. She knelt, spun the dial, and entered the code Daniel had handed her like a love letter. Click. The door opened. She reached in and pulled out the velvet case without even checking what else was inside. No trembling hands. No guilt. Just efficiency. Like she was collecting something she believed she was owed. I watched her zip it into her tote bag. Then she left. My pulse hammered so hard I tasted metal. I could have gone back right then. I could have met her at the door. But I stayed put, because I needed the moment to happen where she couldn't talk her way out of it. The tracker I'd slipped into the case pinged as she drove toward downtown. Straight to a pawn shop. I parked 3 blocks away and walked the rest, hood up, head down, my heart banging against my ribs. Through the front window I saw her at the counter, smiling too brightly, the way people do when they're trying to look innocent. She placed the velvet case on the glass. The clerk lifted it carefully. What have we got? Lauren's smile tightened. Family heirloom, she said. I'm just exploring options. He opened it. The case tipped. Metal screws rolled out like spilled teeth, scattering across the tile floor. Customers turned. Someone laughed, thinking it was a joke. Then the clerk noticed the folded note and read it, slow and clear. I'm watching you, Lauren. Her face drained of color. A sound tore out of her, half scream, half gasp, like the air had been stolen from her lungs. My phone vibrated in my palm, the camera app still open, still recording, still showing the empty space where the watch should have been. I stepped forward before I could stop myself. Lauren spun, eyes wild, searching the room. She saw me. For one long second, she didn't move. The pawn shop felt frozen around us, the buzzing lights, the dusty guitars on the wall, the clerk holding the note like it was evidence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Daniel is on his way, I said. And so are the police, if you make me call. Her lips parted. No words came out. The clerk finally found his voice. Ma'am, is this yours? Lauren's hands shook now. It's my husband's, she whispered, as if saying it softer could make it true. I held up my phone so she could see the footage, her in my bedroom, her hands on my safe, her tote bag swallowing what she'd come for. Her eyes flicked to the screen and then away, like it burned. When Daniel arrived, he looked from me to her to the screws on the floor. Confusion first. Then understanding. Then something in him broke. Lauren tried to cry. Daniel, please. I can explain. He didn't shout. That was the worst part. He just said, very quietly, you stole from my mother. She grabbed for Daniel's sleeve. He stepped back, like her touch could stain him. I didn't have a choice, she said, words tumbling out. I lost it. The money. 150,000. I thought I could sell this, pay it back, and fix everything before you knew. Fix everything? Daniel's voice went thin. By stealing from my mother? A teen by the door lifted his phone to record. Two women whispered behind their hands. Lauren looked smaller. Her eyes flicked to the door as if someone might burst in. They're threatening me, she whispered. I was scared. I kept my voice steady. Fear doesn't give you permission. It only shows what you're willing to do. The clerk set the case down carefully. Ma'am, he said to Lauren, I'm calling the police. Lauren's face crumpled. Please, Mrs. Hale. Please. Just don't tell him. Daniel stared at the screws on the floor, then at the note. What is this? He asked me. A decoy, I said. The watch is safe. Pain flashed across his eyes, at the trap, at my secrecy, but it was swallowed by relief and horror. Outside, a siren wailed closer, then stopped. Lauren's shoulders collapsed. I'm sorry, she repeated, softer each time. Daniel exhaled, shaking. You're sorry you got caught. When the officer stepped into the shop, Daniel moved beside me. No shouting. Just the truth fully where she couldn't rewrite it. Silence filled the room after the officer finished taking statements. The pawn shop returned to its usual noises, coins clinking, a radio murmuring, someone coughing in the back, but for us everything stayed suspended, like the air had turned to glass. Daniel didn't look at Lauren again. Not once. He stared at the velvet case, at the scattered screws, at the note the clerk had set beside the register as if it were a receipt for a life we could no longer return. Outside, Chicago kept moving. A bus sighed at the curb. Tires hissed on wet pavement. People walked past the window with shopping bags, never knowing a family was coming apart under fluorescent lights. Lauren tried to speak. Daniel, please. He flinched at his own name in her mouth. I watched my son's jaw tighten, the muscle jumping near his ear the way it used to when he fought tears as a boy. He was trying so hard to stay composed, to be the adult, to keep this from turning into a spectacle. But betrayal doesn't stay private. It leaks. It stains. When we finally stepped outside, he stopped on the sidewalk and bent forward, hands on his knees, breathing like he'd run a mile. I'm sorry, I said, because mothers always say it, even when we didn't cause the pain. He shook his head without looking up. You were right, he whispered. And I was blind. That word, blind, hit me harder than any shout could have. Because love makes you blind on purpose. It teaches you to look away from what you don't want to see. We drove home in silence. Lauren's car was gone by the time we arrived, as if she'd already started erasing herself. The house felt different with Daniel inside it, heavier, like the walls remembered. In my bedroom, I moved the painting aside and opened the safe. My hands were steadier than I expected. The real watch lay where it belonged, wrapped in cloth, the stopped hands still pointing at 8:17. Daniel stared at it for a long time. His throat worked. Then tears finally slipped down his face, quiet, helpless, unmanly only in the way cruel people use that word. It wasn't the money, he said. It's that she could do that. To you. To us. I stepped into him and held him the way I hadn't held him since he was 16 and his father's funeral suit swallowed his shoulders. He clutched my sweater like it was the only solid thing left. Over the next weeks, the truth moved through our lives like a cold front. Daniel asked questions he'd avoided for months. Lauren confessed to debts, to hidden accounts, to messages from people I'd never met. Some of it sounded like fear. Some of it sounded like excuses. All of it sounded too late. He filed for divorce within weeks. The paperwork arrived in neat envelopes. The court dates sat on the calendar like bruises. Friends called with careful voices. Family offered opinions. I refused to take calls from anyone who wanted drama. I had watched enough Pain to know it doesn't need an audience. The house did feel emptier after she was gone. But it also felt honest again. No more sweet texts. No more practiced smiles. No more footsteps in the hallway that made my stomach tighten. Some nights Daniel stayed on my couch, staring at the ceiling until dawn. Other nights he went home and sat alone in the apartment he and Lauren had shared, surrounded by furniture that suddenly looked like evidence. We didn't talk about forgiveness. Not yet. We talked about breakfast. About work. About how to keep breathing when your trust has been ripped out of you. And slowly, so slowly it was almost invisible, my son began to come back to himself. I blamed myself in flashes, the way you blame yourself when you survive. If I'd confronted her the first time my instincts whispered, would Daniel have been spared? But then I'd remember the footage, her calm hands, her certainty, and the guilt would harden into clarity. You can't love someone into being honest. One Sunday, Daniel and I boxed up the last of her things. A scarf still scented with her perfume. A pair of heels by the door. Wedding photos tucked in a drawer like they were hiding. Daniel held one frame, stared at their smiles, and turned it face down. I don't hate her, he said. I hate what she did. When the divorce was finalized, Daniel didn't celebrate. He just came to my kitchen, sat at the table, and exhaled as if he'd been holding his breath for a year. I feel stupid, he admitted. You feel human, I said. You trusted. That night, after he left, I checked the safe and stood in the hallway listening to the clock tick. Time kept moving, whether we wanted it to or not. And so, eventually, did we. The next morning he texted me a single line, I slept 3 hours, but I slept. It wasn't much, but it was proof. I made him eggs, and we ate without talking about her. Grief still sat with us, but it no longer held the only chair. The house stayed quiet, but for the first time in months, the quiet didn't lie. Not now. A year passed, and the ache didn't vanish, but it changed shape. Daniel sold the condo he and Lauren had shared and used the money to start over somewhere that didn't feel like an echo. Seattle wasn't a miracle cure, but it was rain and fresh air and strangers who didn't know the story. He called me from a small rented space with a leaky ceiling and said, almost shyly, Mom, I signed the lease for the cafe. It wasn't the big downtown place he'd once dreamed about. It was smaller, 12 tables, a pastry case, a chalkboard menu he wrote on himself. But when he sent me a photo, I saw his hands in it, steady again, covered in flour, building something honest. I flew out the week he opened. On opening morning, he unlocked the door like it was a sacred ritual. The first customer was a nurse coming off a night shift. She ordered black coffee and a cinnamon roll and said, thank you, like she meant it. Daniel smiled the way he used to smile before he learned to guard his heart. Later that afternoon, he wiped the counter, glanced around to make sure no one was listening, and said, Mom. I met someone. I didn't react too fast. I'd learned that rushing joy can scare it away. What's her name? I asked. Claire, he said, and the softness in his voice told me more than the name ever could. She doesn't ask about assets. She asks how I'm sleeping. She notices when I'm quiet and doesn't demand an explanation. She just stays. When I finally met Claire, she came to the cafe carrying a bag of oranges and a takeout soup for Daniel because he'd skipped lunch. No performance. No charm turned up to 11. Just quiet care. She looked me in the eye and said, I'm glad he has you. That sentence cracked something open in me. 6 months later, Daniel called and said, don't freak out, but we're moving in together. Then, even more carefully, and she's pregnant. I sat down on my kitchen floor and laughed and cried at the same time, because life can be cruel and kind in the same breath. Now I have 2 grandchildren. A little boy with Daniel's serious eyes and a little girl who laughs like wind chimes. When they visit, my house sounds alive again, tiny footsteps, toy cars, the squeal of bath time. Daniel watches them like he's relearning what safety feels like. The watch rests in a safety deposit box downtown, not because I'm afraid anymore, but because some treasures deserve a door that only love can open. Daniel has the key. I have the other. And no one reaches for it with greedy hands. The first time I held the baby, Daniel hovered behind me like he was afraid the past might reach out and snatch this moment away. I turned the child slightly so Daniel could see his tiny face and said, "He's here." "You did it." Daniel blinked hard, then pressed his forehead to my shoulder the way he used to when he was small. Daniel started therapy in Seattle. After a few months his language changed. He stopped saying, "I should have known." He started saying, "I ignored signs because I wanted the story to be true." That difference mattered. It wasn't self-hatred anymore. It was learning. Claire helped without trying to be the hero. She didn't demand that he move on. She simply made space for him to be messy and still lovable. On weekends she brought the kids to the cafe for a taste test, and customers would laugh as Daniel pretended to be offended by their sticky fingers on the sample trays. One rainy Sunday, after the lunch rush, Daniel slid an envelope across the table toward me. Inside was a handwritten note and a key. "For the deposit box," he said. "Not because you need it, but because I want you to know you don't have to carry everything alone." I stared at that key for a long time. It looked so ordinary. But it represented something new, a partnership between mother and son that wasn't built on fear or secrecy. Just boundaries. Just trust that had been tested and rebuilt. The cafe began to thrive in small ways. Regulars learned Daniel's name. Daniel hired a young barista and treated her with the patience he wished he'd been given during his darkest months. On the cafe wall, Daniel hung a simple sign, "You're safe here." When Claire and Daniel got married, it wasn't a ballroom. It was a small garden, string lights, warm bread, and children running in circles. Daniel walked me to my seat and whispered, "Thank you for protecting me, even when I didn't understand it yet." I squeezed his hand and said, "Promise me one thing." "Anything." "Never confuse love with permission again." He nodded once, firm. "Never." And when he laughs now, it's not forced. It fills the room. It reminds me that healing isn't loud, it's steady, and it stays. For once, our future feels ours. Now. The most valuable treasures aren't the ones inside a safe. They're the people who would never try to break it open. I don't regret setting the trap. I regret that I had to. Love without boundaries is just hope with its eyes closed. And hope doesn't protect your family, courage does. I didn't expose Lauren for revenge. I did it for clarity. My son deserved the truth, even if it hurt. Because betrayal doesn't start with theft, it starts with secrecy. If something feels wrong in your life, don't silence that instinct. Pay attention. Ask questions. Protect what matters. Names and identifying details have been changed for privacy. Now I want to ask you. What would you have done in my place? Expose her, or stay silent? Tell me what city you're watching from. I really do read the comments. And if stories about family, betrayal, and second chances speak to you, stay with me.